If you were watching the news this past week, you may have seen that young 19-year-old pilot who made a stopover in Montreal. Her name is Zara Rutherford. I've been cheering her on because she was born in Belgium, my father's home country, and she's trying to set a world record, but she's also trying to encourage young girls to consider aviation as a career. She began her trip around the world solo, her around-the-world flight, at 19, and if she succeeds, she will be the youngest woman to ever fly around the world solo. Now, this is unusual, but the next youngest woman was 30. Apparently, no 30-year-old woman or less has ever flown around the world solo. I couldn't believe this record has held for that long. She will be stopping in 52 countries as she goes around the world, and Montreal was a stop this week. And I like the story because it reminds me of one of my childhood heroes, Charles Lindbergh. He was an American aviator, a military man, an inventor, and an activist. And at the age of 25 in 1927, he went from obscurity to stardom, literally, by doing the first solo flight across the Atlantic. It was the first time it had been done. He built the plane himself. It was called the Spirit of St. Louis. He took off from New York City, flew up, crossed over Newfoundland, and that gave him the bearing to fly straight across all the way to Ireland. There was a lot of adulation. The aviation industry was just starting for the little plane that he constructed. He actually made several technical developments that went into use in aviation after the fact. And one of the concerns is that in the places where he took off, I think we've got a picture of the field from which he took off in New York. And then when he landed at Le Bourget airfield in Paris, he was swarmed by the crowds, and he was actually concerned as he landed. He had a hard time landing because he didn't want to land and decapitate somebody with the propellers from the plane. He had to hold off his landing, and shortly after he landed, the propeller was still spinning, and he was absolutely swarmed by the crowd. You see the picture of the crowd there swarming the plane because of what he had done. When he returned to New York City with his plane, he was greeted by what is still the biggest ticker tape parade that was ever held in New York City. But it doesn't talk much about the long hours that he was in flight. For 33 and a half hours it took him to cross 5,800 kilometers, and there were moments where he had a hard time. He talked about falling asleep. At one point, after he'd been awake for over 25 hours, he talked about hallucinations. He had thoughts that there was somebody else in the cockpit with him. And there was the boredom. Literally, for almost 25 of those 33 hours, he was flying over open water with nothing to look at, nothing to see, just the blue sky above him. And then, of course, flying at night, which was particularly dangerous, and through a bank of fog. When he eventually landed, he was greeted by the crowds, as I say. And the thing that overwhelmed people when they realized how he had been flying and the conditions inside the cockpit, in order to do this, he needed to put so much fuel on board that he got rid of any additional weight. This is a picture from inside his cockpit, and this is the wicker chair he sat on. There was a comfortable seat in the plane, but it was too heavy, and it was dragging down the plane, so he replaced it, and he sat in this wicker chair. He actually got rid of the cushion to get rid of as much weight as possible. He actually talks about choosing the right pair of socks because he was trying to go as light as possible in the plane to make sure that he'd have enough fuel to cross. And we like to celebrate the moments. We like to celebrate the moments when we take off from New York City and land in Paris and the crowds are there. But often the things we do in life, there's the 33 and a half hours alone of patient waiting in the darkness, trying not to fall asleep. Waiting is such a large part of our lives, and often waiting alone in isolation. It is a strange phenomena of our world that loneliness and isolation have become two of the gravest problems in our society. We have thousands of friends on our Facebook page. We are connected to our family by Zoom calls and video calls more than ever before. The cities are getting larger and larger. We live in apartment buildings with dozens of housing units shared with hundreds and thousands of people. When the COVID is over, we'll be back on the bus and the metro, jammed tight with large crowds every morning and evening on our way to work. And yet we are lonelier than we have ever been. We have a hard time with quietness and with waiting. As James draws his book to an end this morning, we have a couple of more Sunday mornings to go. There's some salutations, a few more things to go. But in the last large piece of his text, he talks about the fact that as Christians, we are people who wait. James chapter 5, and we'll read verses 7 to 11 this morning. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. James tells us repeatedly to be patient, to wait. We live in waiting of the coming of the Lord. Well, James, it's easier said than done. But James uses three verbs. There's three things he urges us to do. And the first one that appears several times, he urges us to be patient. Interesting that this is a verb in the passive voice. Being patient is not about doing something. As somebody has said, hurry up and wait. We have a hard time. Being patient is about our character. The Greek word that's translated patient here, to be patient, comes from two words, from Greek word that's composed of two words. The Greek word is makrothemio. And macro is the word for long, and themio, you're not going to like this, is the word for suffer. Suffer long. If you still read the Old King James, instead of the word patient, the word is long suffering. Be long suffering. This is the part about being patient that we don't like. It's about just waiting. Nothing that you can do, nothing that you can do to move things along. You just have to sit and wait. We have a waiting story in our family. One of our first little boys, when he was 5 or 6, had injured himself, and he had a couple of headaches in the weeks that followed. And as we went to the doctor suggested that we use children's aspirin. And when we gave him the first aspirin, he said, "What's it going to do?" We said, "Well, it'll take your headache away." And he said, "How soon?" And Debbie guessed and said, "Well, probably about 5 minutes." He knew how to use the timer on the microwave, so he took the aspirin, went to the microwave, and set the timer for 5 minutes. And when 5 minutes were up, he came back to the kitchen and said, "It didn't work." And we said, "Well, wait another 5 minutes." We're not good at doing the waiting. But that verb about being patient, it's not about something we do, it's about something we are. And the challenge, of course, is that we want God to make us more patient, but it's a prayer that we do not dare pray. Because when you ask God to make you more patient, you know what He's going to do, right? He's going to send you some challenges that will teach you to be patient. Don't ask God for patience unless you're really serious. James says we don't grumble and groan. We don't complain. Being patient is about character. It's about who we are. It's about our headspace. It's about what our heart is doing while we're waiting. And depending on who you are, there are different things that we have a harder time waiting for. I often tell husbands that when your wife tells you she's almost ready, what she means is the same amount of time as when you call home and you say you're almost done at work and you're almost heading home. That's the same length of time as when she's almost ready. There's a lot of places where we have to learn to wait. Some of you are waiting for a spouse. And so what do you do while you wait for a spouse? The Lord would like to talk to you about the kind of spouse you're going to be when it's your turn. What do you do when you wait for a spouse and you wait a week and another month and another month and another year? Maybe the Lord is working on the kind of spouse you'll be when it will be your turn. As you wait, be patient, James says. It's about character. It's about who you are. It's not about what you're doing with your hands. It's about what's happening in your heart and in your head. In some of the terminology in this section, James actually uses the word for pregnancy. At one point, he actually talks about that 9-month gestation period. You wait, but you wait with a point. James says, as Christians, we're waiting people, but we're waiting for something. We're waiting for someone. And that's what gives the color to our patience. James begins right off the bat and he says, we are waiting for the coming of the Lord. There's a hope that we have. There's something that we expect. And James drives home the point with the illustration of the farmer. He brings us back to the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, the growing season stretched from the fall in the month of October until the spring. There were 2 rainy seasons. There was the early rains in October, and there were the late rains in April. In October, the rains would come. They'd make the soil moist and ready to receive the seed. And so shortly after the spring rains, you would plant your seed very quickly while the ground was still moist and the moisture was still there, and the seed would begin to grow. And then you would wait 2 months, and 3 months, and 4 months, and 5 months, and the ground would get dry, and the plants would struggle, and they'd slowly make their way up, and every night you went to bed hoping that the seed was still growing. The plants would struggle through the winter to continue to grow. And just when you thought the plants were about to die for lack of water, then the late rains would come in the month of April. Give it one final shot of rain, and the plants would sprout up, and then the fruit would come up, and the grains and the kernel would come up from the power of the rain. And so you waited between the 2 seasons, between the early rain and the late rain. The early rain had come, God had been good, and then you waited. You knew that the God who brought the early rain would bring the late rain as well. And you wait. So just like the farmer, the faith that we have as Christians, it's not this blind faith. It's not, man, I hope this works out okay. I hope this turns out all right. I hope she shows up. I hope he's not too late. The hope that we have is in somebody who's trustworthy. We're waiting for the coming of the Lord. And we believe as Christians that when the Lord comes, he's going to make things right. Now, James uses an expression that some people have reacted to. James says we're waiting for the coming of the Lord. The Lord is just around the corner. He's just outside the door. And some people said it sounds like James was wrong. You know, James is writing almost 2,000 years ago, and the Lord hasn't come back yet. Did James get it wrong? There was a period in the 1840s called the Great Disappointment. There was a Baptist preacher by the name of Miller in New York State, and he had done some calculations in the scriptures, and he had come to the conclusion that the Lord was going to come back on the 22nd of October, 1844. Now, we know you're not supposed to do that. The scriptures tell us that nobody knows the moment when the Lord's going to return. But man, this Baptist preacher was pretty convincing, and he got hundreds of thousands of people to sell their cars, quit their jobs, sell their homes, sell their farms, and they moved to this big open field with tents in New York State, and they waited. And the 22nd of October, 1844 came, the sun came up, and nothing happened, and they sang, and they prayed, and they sang, and they prayed, and the sun went down, and they sang, and they prayed, and they worried, and they sang, and they prayed, and then the clock hit midnight, and it was October 23rd, 1844, and the Lord hadn't come back. So he does what any good preacher would do. He went back to the books, he recalculated, and said, oh, I made a mistake. Lord's coming back in 6 months, and they tried again, and it still didn't work. Out of that movement actually grew the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They re-examined the theology, re-examined the doctrine, and started from scratch again. But we don't do that in that sense. When James says that the Lord is going to return, that we're waiting for the Lord, the point isn't that he is going to come back in 2 minutes. The point is that there's a moment when he is going to return. When I was in high school, I had a friend whose father was an engineer who worked on international projects. And when the 3 kids were teenagers, the parents decided that the kids were old enough now that the parents could both go away for a couple of months. And his dad was called away on an engineering project in Africa for about 4 months. And so the mom and dad left 3 teenagers together in charge of the house. I don't want to tell you all manner of parties that occurred during the 4 months that the parents were gone. But during the 4 months, they knew the day would come. There was a day on the calendar. This is the day when mom and dad are coming back. And the parents were actually very shrewd. They came back a week early. Surprise! I'm told that the house was not in great shape. And they told their parents, the last week you're going to be away. That's the week we were going to clean up the house and get ready for you. James says that as Christians, it's not that we live in fear that in 30 seconds the Lord's going to be back, but it's that we live with the expectation that he is returning, and that makes a difference in the decisions that we make. That means that this life is not all there is. That means that there's something on the other side that we're thinking about, that we're planning for. It means that the real life that we expect is not this one, it's the next life to come. And the point isn't that we are people who are waiting 5 minutes or that we're people who are waiting 10 years. The point is that we are people who are waiting. We're waiting for something. We're waiting for someone. And with that solid expectation, it does something to our hearts and to our minds and to the way we wait. And so James uses his second verb. The first verb was be patient, be long-suffering. And the second verb is a strange Greek verb. It's the verb sterizo. It means to establish. It's a word that a building contractor might use when he's putting in a foundation, when you establish a building on a solid foundation. James says, do this to your heart because you're waiting, because you know the Lord's coming back. As you wait, make your heart solid. Brace yourself. The Greek verb comes up in a couple of interesting points. In Luke chapter 9, as Jesus is beginning his ministry, Luke tells us that Jesus had this end goal, and his end goal is that he was going to wind up in Jerusalem where he was going to die for our sins. He was looking ahead to the cross. During the 3 years of his ministry, even as Jesus starts his ministry in Luke chapter 9, Luke tells us that Jesus had his face set firmly to go to Jerusalem. He uses the same verb there about Jesus. The same way that Jesus lived his life and lived his ministry looking forward to that moment at the cross, the way his heart was firmly set and established on doing that, this is the way our hearts are firmly set and established. The fact that we're waiting for something and for someone doesn't make us wishy-washy. On the contrary, it makes us firm and solid and grounded. We're not people who flitter from one thing to the other. We know what life is about. There's a goal to our lives. We know what we're living for. We know who we're living for. So we learn to be patient and we establish our hearts. And the example of the waiting farmer leads us to the third waiting verb. There's a part of the process that the farmer doesn't control. When the late rains come, they might come at the end of March. They might come early in April. They might come in the middle of the month of April. They might come a little later than usual. The farmer's got no control of that. There's no point sitting up at night waiting and wondering. Don't worry about the stuff you can't handle, you can't change. But there's something that the farmer does. He plants the seed. He makes sure to plant the seed in the right way. As the plants grow, they need to be recovered. He goes up and down the rows with his hoe and he puts more dirt along the plants. He pulls the weeds out. There's birds and animals that want to come and dig out the weeds. He chases the animals and the birds away. There's all of that he does. God does his part, making the seed grow, and the farmer does his part. And so there's a third verb that James uses. We are to be patient. We are to be steadfast. We're to persevere. In verse 11, a very strange verb. The Greek makes a lot of these compound verbs from two words. The word is hypomeno, from under and to stick under it. It's like carrying a weight. There's a job you got to do. There's a task you're given. James says, stick to it. This thing you're carrying, this job you've got to do, hang in there. Keep doing it. Stay under it. 3 verbs. This is how we wait. Be patient. It's about who we are. Establish your hearts. It's about how we think and how we worry while we wait. And persevere. Be steadfast. Keep doing the things you're called to do, the things you have to do. You keep doing them. And then James ends it with this promise. He says, consider those who remain steadfast. Look at the lives of those who hung in there. He says, remember the prophets. Remember Jeremiah and Isaiah and Elijah. They stuck to it. God gave them a job to do, and they hung in there. They kept preaching even when there's no result. They kept preaching even when they were alone. They kept at it even when they felt they were the only ones left. And you look at these men and these women, you say, wow, look at what they did. They did that because they hung in there. They kept at it. And then he uses an interesting example. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job. And you've seen the purpose of the Lord and how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. And our problem with Job is that we don't remember how it ends. If you're like me, when you think about Job, there's this verse from Job that you think about. Right at the beginning of Job, when God has this conversation with the devil, and everything gets taken away from Job. And you remember what Job says. I'm sure you remember, because this is the verb from Job we always quote. From chapter 1, verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will return. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I guarantee you, 90% of you, when I ask you about Job, this is the one piece you know. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, and that's where you stop. And this is true, and this is good, and we need to remember that when we're deprived of things that we love. But that's not how Job ends. You know how Job ends. Job is restored. In the goodness of God and the mercy of God and the compassion of God, Job is restored beyond anything that he had lost. Whatever it is that you have lost as you wait, it will be restored. There's even a promise in the Old Testament as God speaks to his people who have been punished for their sin, whose crops and whose possessions and whose land have been stolen and ripped away by the locust. God even says, I will replace the years that the locust has stolen. And so when James thinks about the example of Job, he says, don't stop at chapter 1. Don't stop when Job says, the Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. He says, go to the end of the book. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away, and the Lord is blessed even more abundantly. Blessed be the name of the Lord. We wait, and we wait in trust in a God who is compassionate and merciful. James says, you have heard of the steadfastness of Job and of the purpose of the Lord in mercy and compassion. As the Lord asks you to wait, as the Lord asks you to be patient. His purpose for you is not that you suffer martyr and that you live in deprivation and that you be stripped of everything you love and that you never have any joy. This is not the Lord's purpose for you. Just as the Lord's purpose for Job was this temporary moment of challenge and then this blessing at the end. We are patient and we wait together for a Lord who is compassionate and merciful and good. You know the purpose of the Lord. You know the purpose of the Lord. He is compassionate and he is merciful. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Amen. Father, teach us to wait. We hesitate to ask, but teach us patience. Teach us patience because the things we are waiting for are worth the wait. The one we are waiting for is worth the wait. Father, your word tells us that no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, and the heart of man has not imagined the things that God has prepared for those who love him. Teach us to wait. In Christ's name, amen.